This is how I make a lemon cake with no animal products. First, grease and line a baking tray. I use Nuttelex around the sides and a good quality baking paper in the base. But if you prefer, or if you don't have any baking paper, just put a bit more grease on the bottom and a thin layer of flour on top of it. Grate the rind of 1 lemon. Put it aside for later. Next, squeeze the juice out of the same lemon. If you have a small lemon, you may need 2. If you have a large lemon, like this other one I have here from my sister's garden, you probably don't need the whole lemon. Okay, let's make the cake. Some people measure everything very carefully. I am not one of those people. 2½ cups of self-raising flour. I use 2 cups of wholemeal plus ½ a cup of plain. I do use a sifter for the flour. This is not strictly necessary, but it's traditional. I've tried it both ways, and it doesn't seem to make any difference, so I follow tradition for no particular reason. So as I said, 2 cups of wholemeal and ½ a cup of plain. Three teaspoons of baking powder. To be honest, 3 teaspoons is probably more than we need. And again, as you can see, I'm not a particularly careful measurer. A little bit of moisture seems to have got into my baking powder. The sieve comes in handy after all. 1 1/3 cups of castor sugar. Looks like I'll have just enough. Okay, because I'm a vegan cook, I'm not going to put any egg in. But this cake can be a bit crumbly, so I'm going to use some egg replacer. It's basically a very fine sticky flour to bind things together. You can get it at the supermarket, often in the health food section. Or of course, if you're not vegan, you can just put in a real egg instead. You're actually supposed to mix this up with some water first, but I find it works better just to add it to the dry ingredients like this, and add a little extra liquid later on. I tend not to mix anything until I've added all the dry ingredients. This is a more effective strategy with a chocolate cake than a lemon cake, because I can tell then how well I've mixed it by how evenly distributed the cocoa is. Anyway. Canola oil. You can use any oil you like, although I don't recommend early harvest olive oil unless you really want your cake to taste like olives. My recipe says 9 tablespoons of oil, which is 180 ml or about 2/3 of a cup. I tend to use less than this, more like about ½ a cup. Mix it in well. The traditional wording is until it resembles breadcrumbs. Now add 1½ cups of water and the lemon juice. I tend to reserve a little of the water until I've mixed it up a bit. This batch does seem to need it. Add the lemon rind. And I add some poppy seeds. You don't have to, but I quite like it with poppy seeds in my lemon cake. Mix it all in, make sure it's nice and even. Then just pour it into the prepared tray. This tray is really a little bit too small. I always bake with a tray underneath in the oven to catch any drips. That is a little full. It's going to bulge out a bit at the top, but that's okay. This recipe is really better suited to making 2 8 by 8 inch square cakes, or round ones about that size too, of course. Bake it at about 165 degrees Celsius for 40 minutes. I usually check it a few minutes before. Not quite ready yet. It should spring back to a light touch, and a skewer stuck into it should come out clean. Not like this. Let's put it back for a bit longer. Ah, that looks better. Perfect. After it's been sitting out for a couple of minutes, run a knife gently around the edge to loosen it from the tray. Grab a cooling rack, put it on top, feet pointing up of course, and then flip it out. Peel off the baking paper, and voila! To make the icing, get yourself a nice large bowl with steep sides so the icing sugar doesn't fly everywhere. You'll also need a sieve and a wooden spoon. Make sure the sieve sits nicely in the bowl. Once again, you can see I'm not precise about measuring the ingredients. How much icing sugar you need depends on how thick you want it to end up on your cake. I'd suggest starting with about a cup of sugar, which should be more than enough. You can always freeze it for next time, assuming you can resist the temptation to just eat whatever's left over. If any moisture has got into your icing sugar, it'll turn into hard little lumps like mine has. That's what the sieve is for. A few minutes of pushing and scraping against the metal wire is all that's needed. Add a bit of margarine. I use Nuttelex, which is vegan and, in spite of the name, doesn't contain any nuts. It's a perfect vegan substitute for butter or margarine in any recipe. The amount you add is entirely up to you. Without any, you get a sharp, crisp icing, and with a lot of margarine it turns out soft and creamy and rich. You choose a compromise you like. Mix it in well with the sugar. If you prefer, you can use your hands for this. The heat from your hands will melt the margarine just a little and make it easier to combine. I'm using a little vanilla for flavour. I'll basically use a teaspoon of vanilla essence as the first bit of moisture I add. The rest will be water. The key to making icing is to add moisture just a little bit at a time. Start with maybe a teaspoon at a time and mix it in really well. By the end of the process, you should be adding just a few drops at a time. It's really important not to add too much at once. It'll change all at once to just the right texture. You want it to be smooth and spreadable, but not runny. Of course, if you go too far, you can always just add in a bit more dry icing sugar. Then just spread it smoothly over the cake. Yummo!